thank you very much for this keynote, Mr. Steinbrück. And I just hope that for the rest of this discussion you won't pay too much attention what the ambassador told you. For the next hour or so, I will have the privilege of sitting in the center of this exclusive panel, which will deal with one of the world economy's most urgent problems, which is how some people would rather say if the crisis of the Eurozone can be solved. You see, I'm not talking about the crisis of the Euro anymore after your keynote. And I'm looking forward to discussing this not only with Per Steinbrück, who I'm not going to introduce, just maybe add that he has been called in a recent poll that has been published a few days ago the most important German politician after Angela Merkel, which is quite unusual for somebody who's not in government.
Now I feel ashamed.
But I have also two brilliant economists on my side who will help us to gain a better understanding of what's going on in Europe and which role German leadership plays in this. On my right, you can see Clemens Fuß, who's one of the people who constantly move between the two worlds, which seem not to understand each other very well. That is the Anglo-Saxon world, which tends to be extremely critical of all kinds of German austerity programs on the one hand, and the world of German politics and economists, which is with its strong belief in debt cutting and fiscal policy and all kinds of instruments and institutions pursuing that. And a vocabulary, as I think Guido Goldman once said that in one of his talks, where debt and guilt are the same word in the German language. So in a way, Clemens Fuß is not only an economist, but also an economic diplomat, but I hope one who does not hesitate to say in a clear manner what he thinks went wrong in the latest attempts to save the euro. Professor Fuß is research director at the Oxford University Center for Business Taxation and professor of business taxation, a position he held since 2007. He's a member of the academic advisory board of the German Federal Ministry of Finance. So in a way, you were the advisor of Per Steinbrück some years ago. Professor Fuß has a PhD in economics from the University of Cologne, and prior to Oxford, he was a lecturer at the University of Munich. And in March, he will go back to Germany to the Center for European Economic Research in Mannheim, heading the institute with Thomas Kohl. And I may add that the ZEW is one of the most prestigious European institutes for economic research. Danny Roderick is on my left, is one of Harvard's economic superstars whose ideas are perceived and discussed worldwide by a global audience. Professor Roderick went to school in Istanbul and after that became a student at Harvard College. He got a PhD from Princeton University and became professor of international political economy at the Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. I stress the first steps because there are so many students here who know want to know how to do what you did. After that, he was teaching. He's teaching at the school all the time, and he's published widely in the areas of international economics, economic development, and political economy. He's affiliated with many important influential institutions like the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States, the Center for Economic Policy Research in London, and the Council of Foreign Relations, just to name just a few. He has written the book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far?, which has been called one of the most important books of the decade by Business Week. And his most recent book is called The Globalization Paradox, that came out last fall. And I think it stresses the idea that in a globalized world economy, the institutions of national democracies have to play a bigger role, and that, to say it briefly, globalization seems to work best if it's not overdone. We'll see how these insights can be applied to Europe's situation today. For beginning, I would like to invite both of you to comment on what Mr. Steinbrück said. Professor Fuß, I think you like the concept of leading from behind that Angela Merkel stands for, maybe to a larger degree than what Per Steinbrück talked about. Why is that so? Is it because you agree to what Thomas de Maizière, a member of the German cabinet, who we will listen to later in the afternoon, said everything else is quite expensive for Germany, that people who say they like or they want German leadership, as he put it, just want the German credit card?
Yes, thanks. Let me first thank the organizers for the invitation. I think this is a tremendous conference. There is, in fact, a German conference at Oxford later this year, but I'm not quite sure we can match this one. So I would say Harvard 1, Oxford maybe 0, we'll see. Regarding German leadership or the absence of German leadership in the Euro crisis, I think how you assess this really depends, I think it was mentioned in the keynote speech, really depends on what you think that this crisis really is. If I have to say, if I had to describe it in one sentence, I would say this is a credit boom gone wrong. It's not just a government debt crisis, but it's more generally a credit boom we've had in the periphery. And this at some point, this is not unusual. It's something we've seen in many places in the world economy. We've seen this in Asia, in economic history many times. There is a big boom. People are happy. Investors invest. Interest rates were low, and at some point, people start to feel uncomfortable, and they stop investing. And this, when this happens, this comes very quickly and very suddenly. And then the question is, how do we get out of the situation? And so if that's true, I think overcoming this crisis requires basically two things. It requires what you have to do when you want to overcome this kind of credit boom situation. First of all, bring down the deficits, so the increase in debt, which means bring down the current account deficits of the periphery. And secondly, bring down the stock of debt. And in a market economy, there is a very simple mechanism for this, which is called bankruptcy. Now the trouble is here we have a situation where the debt stock is very large, where we're talking about entire economies, and most importantly, we have a financial sector which is extremely fragile. Okay, so that we cannot just go ahead and say let things happen. And this is the situation. And when you now think as a government, what can you do about it? I think the first thing to recognize is that there is no very easy and straightforward way out of the situation. Now, if you compare the different players in this game within Europe, you have the creditor countries, and Germany is the biggest creditor country. And stabilizing the situation in a way is a public good. I want to make this rather brief. Is a public good within the Eurozone. And there's a lot of economic research about this kind of situation where a public good is provided among different players. And one of the key results is that when you are the biggest player, you are in a very bad situation because you are going to bear the cost. Okay, and I think there is.
Thomas is right with the credit card problem.
There is this credit card problem, but I think I'm very much in favor of ideas of uniting Europe. Everything that's been said, I think it's fine. But at the same time, I think if you want to understand this crisis, you have to admit that there are different interests within countries, between the financial sectors and governments and taxpayers, and between countries. And I say, if you're in a situation like the German government at the moment and you want to avoid bearing too much of a burden, the strategy of leading from behind, of being careful before saying we're the first to set up the big bazooka, makes sense to some extent.
Mr. Roderick, would we be better off with more leadership, with more German leadership in the Euro crisis or Eurozone crisis of the last 2 years?
If you're asking an economist about leadership, we're really in trouble. But let me try to say something about it. But again, to begin, let me thank the organizers for a wonderful event, and especially Mr. Steinberg for a keynote that I thought was really fantastic. Again, subject to my limitations as an economist, expounding on issues of leadership, it does strike me as we should have seen more leadership. And let me define what I mean by leadership in this context. I think there are two elements of leadership that we should have seen more of. One is to be a little bit clearer about the options that we have. I think one attribute of leadership is to communicate to the public what are the choices that we face. I think was implicit in what Mr. Steinberg described, that ultimately going forward, the choice for Europe is going to be either more Europe or it's going to be less Europe. To be more clear, it's going to be either that there's going to be a path towards fiscal and political integration, giving up that sovereignty, because if you are giving up that sovereignty on the fiscal front, you can't do it without mechanisms of political accountability, in some sense carrying local democracy to the European level. That's very hard, as you said. But that's one option. But if you cannot complete the European integration fiscally and politically, the only other option is to ease up on the economic integration, which is the default mode, which is what's going to happen if the fiscal and political integration doesn't happen sufficiently rapidly. And I think we'll see a partial breakup of the Eurozone because of the political and social unsustainability of the current setup. So I think one element of the leadership here I would have liked to see is to be much clearer that these are the stark choices that we face. Communication to the public that, if it's a question of going to the German public by way of referendum, do you want more political Europe or less? Maybe it would have been better if that question was posed earlier rather than later, because I think that is ultimately the medium to long-term question that Europe faces, whether the signal achievement of the 20th century, which was the European economic integration, is going to be continued into the 21st century with an equally signal achievement of completing Europe politically. That's one element of the leadership. I think the second element that I would bring out is the manner in which the crisis was explained once again to the public, and therefore issues of shorter-term crisis management. I think the narrative, unfortunately, that I believe, and not just Merkel, but I think sort of the Northerners put around the crisis was too much that this was a narrative about, Greek profligacy, Greek duplicity, Greek laziness, and it wasn't a narrative about interdependence. I think this was a crisis of interdependence. It wasn't a crisis of Greek duplicity, although there are certainly certain ways in which the Greeks mismanaged their affairs, as did so many other countries. But for every borrower, there is a lender. The Germans were on the lending side. If the Greeks and the Spanish and the Irish were running very large current account deficits, on the other side of the counterpart, there was the Germans and the Dutch. And so this was a crisis of interdependence. Just to make an analogy with the United States, nobody knows, I would guess here, what the current account deficit of Florida is. The current account deficit of Florida is huge, but we don't even calculate it because Florida is part of a larger fiscal and political union. And if the state of Florida, because it has misbehaved, runs into a problem, the state can simply go bankrupt, but every other borrower in the state of Florida will be fine as long as their balance sheets are okay, because they can keep on borrowing. They can appeal to the FDIC for deposit insurance. They have access to the lender of the resort of the Fed. They send their representatives to Washington who can vote for stimulus programs that's going to help out and so forth. And the trouble here was that the Eurozone got caught up midway in its integration process through no fault of its own, because nobody would have guessed the magnitude of the financial crisis that struck. But I think presenting this crisis as a crisis of just the southern profligacy, I think reinforced some of the adverse domestic political dynamics that made it more imperative, if you will, for the German government to lead from behind rather than take the leadership.
We will definitely come back to these aspects of different mentalities, but before that I would like to ask the leadership question, pose the leadership question also to Per Steinbrück once again. Do you think we would be better off with a bailout guarantee for the Greeks in the first place? You've been part of a similar guarantee on the national level. In 2008, you stepped in front of the Chancellery in Germany with Angela Merkel and promised to save, yeah. And do you think the same thing would have been possible on a European level, and would it have been a wiser decision looking back now?
Yes, I tend to assess it like that. I think we made it a long mistake to underestimate this Greece crisis due to the interdependences. Mr. Roderick and Mr. Fuß already mentioned the interdependence of the financial sector, and due to the contagion risks of a default of Greece for other European countries. And in this underestimation, we missed to launch at the right time what I already mentioned as a comprehensive, strong package which could convince the markets not to testify any longer single member states of the European Monetary Union. And I think the time was in May 2010. There was a very famous meeting of the European Council, and they did not decide, they did not pass any decisions, any reliable or reasonable or functional decisions. And that was the very beginning that somebody was compelled to be sort of a deputy actor, and it was the ECB. It was the ECB, and the ECB started in May to do something which appears to many politicians impossible because the legal basis wasn't given. They bought, for the very first time, governmental bonds. In the meantime, they have 220 billion euros on their balance sheet. So I think that was the right moment to give a broader answer. It worked.
So
indeed.
there is a lack of leadership, you are saying,
Yes,
at the moment.
yes, they missed to take over leadership, and they ignored to pass the necessary decisions, and afterwards.
And they being the EU leaders, or Angela Merkel, or the ECB, or who's
No,
they?
I don't want to blame single politicians. It would be very impolite and no political style to blame our own chancellors or something like that, or something.
Oh, okay.
Yes, but well, in Myers, it's a matter of fact that instead of the political stage, suddenly the ECB has to take over the responsibility to act. You mentioned a very specific situation in managing the banking crisis in Germany. Indeed, many of our guests or of the participants of this meeting can't be familiar with that. We had a very clear situation in October 2008. In Germany, because we have been very much frightened by a bank run. And Mrs. Merkel and me went to the television and announced a guarantee for the savings in Germany, and that worked. So sometimes in my imagination I had the idea, well, whenever Merkozy and Jean-Claude Trichet and Jean-Claude Juncker and Barroso and perhaps the responsible commissioner for these problems, in the meantime, it's Olli Rehn, a Finnish commissioner, would have organized a press conference in May and would have announced, we are going to guarantee the Greece sovereign bonds. I think that would have been a very strong performance, which could have impressed the markets.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Fuß, you've defended this leading from behind. How much leadership is necessary when you deal with financial markets who sometimes expect maybe some gesture of leadership or symbols of some kind? The way Per Steinbrück has described it.
I mean, I have to say, I feel slightly uncomfortable with this notion of strong leadership. The trouble is, as was said earlier by Klaus Kleinfeld, leadership it's fine when it goes into the right direction, but it can be misguided. And I think we have various examples, even in the history of European Monetary Union, of clearly misguided leadership. So let me quote two. The first was.
More of that.
Yeah, exactly. So the first was that many countries were admitted, although they didn't satisfy the criteria, and there were warnings. This time, I think the economy is one of the few times where the economists got it right. I mean, there were strong warnings not to extend European Monetary Union, and I very well remember. I personally remember this because I've written it in the beginning of the 90s. I've written we are facing the possibility of sovereign bankruptcies, and we need a procedure for that. And at the time, I wasn't taken serious because it's fine. I was young, but other people and more prominent people have said the same. and weren't taken seriously either. I think this was clearly an example of misguided leadership. The second example was the reaction of the French and German government to the violation of the Stability Pact by these two countries in the early 2000s. I mean, they just said, okay, we violate the rules, let's change them. Now, this was quite unfortunate. I mean, maybe it was right to do more expansionary fiscal policy at this particular moment, but what was underestimated was that this completely swept away any respect for these rules. Some very high-ranking politicians said, this entire pact is stupid. How do you want to explain to people now that they should have respected it if it was stupid? So, there are unfortunately these various examples of completely misguided leadership, and that's why, I would like to make sure that this goes into the right direction. And I think, addressing this crisis is very difficult. I mean, if it is true, I think there are two narratives about this crisis. One is what I've tried to explain just 5 minutes ago, that the underlying problem is a credit boom that went wrong. So I think if that is true, the recipe wouldn't have been an early guarantee for capital markets, because this would just have let the bubble continue. To get rid of the problems we have, if this credit market boom story is correct, we have to get down debt, we have to get to reduce asset prices, we have to reduce wages, get rid of this bubble, and this you cannot do by giving a guarantee which would just let this flow continue. There is another narrative, which is that this is more a crisis of confidence, that this is, the issue here is multiple equilibria, as the economists say, in capital markets, where people just are afraid at a certain point in time, and one fund manager is afraid that the other fund manager may withdraw his investment, and in that kind of situation, a guarantee is the right instrument. I personally think that the first story is more plausible, and that's why I think this wouldn't have been the right direction. But to come back to your question, leadership can easily go in the wrong direction. I mean, Eurobonds, this universal guarantee, providing this without centralized control over fiscal policy. It's like giving your neighbor your credit card and telling him, please don't spend the money. It's not my concept of leadership in that particular case.
I think, Mr. Roderick, I think you dislike the fiscal compact too, maybe for other reasons. But I mean, if you look at it, what happened when the euro was introduced, that the countries agreed on a set of fiscal rules. So the whole story kind of went wrong. What are the countries or the leaders of the countries doing right now? They agree on a set of fiscal rules. So does it make sense to you, or has the situation changed and we are on the right way with what has been agreed on lately?
I think most economists agree that that structurally the European Monetary Union, as it stood in 2008, was unsound. That it was an unstable situation. That it couldn't it couldn't last as is. And some economists looked at this and said, this is utter silliness. Why did the Europeans ever do it? They should never have gotten into it. Others, and I would put myself into that camp, said, yes, but this is a past. This is an ongoing process. And what the Europeans are doing, they have invested in a decades-long process where yes, the process of economic integration has completely outpaced the process of fiscal and political integration, and that's structurally unsound. It creates problems that these will ultimately have to meet, but that this is a process that takes time. Now, I think at the time that the euro was created, I think it's fair to say that nobody would have expected the kind of financial crisis that struck the Eurozone to be in the realm of the possibilities. And let's remember that this wasn't, the Eurozone had its own problems. It had its credit expansion, and I agree with Clemens that that was a problem. But the reason that the Eurozone got into the crisis wasn't because this European credit expansion or the European credit bubble suddenly burst. It was that the crisis came from the United States. And that's what sort of brought all the problems to a head for Europe. So I think my sense is that, look, if we're going to do the backward evaluation, this was a gamble. It was a gamble that was perfectly understandable within a long-term strategy of fiscal and political integration. I think the issue is that once the crisis strikes, what do? And you need a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy. I think the long-term strategy has got to be that we complete the union as quickly as possible with the fiscal and political dimensions. But as political leaders, we have to, I think, be out in front, because to say that if we want more Europe, this is what we're going to have. Then there's the issue of how do you deal with the problem of the short run, all the damage that the bursting of the credit bubble creates. Now, Clemens, I think, is absolutely right that there is an adjustment that has to take place, given that now you've had a decade of credit explosion. But that cannot be the only thing, because the moment the credit bubble bursts, you are also creating a whole set of collateral economic damage, rising unemployment, economies going into a recession, and you also have to have mechanisms that are going to be taking care of those things.
Like what?
Well, I mean, it was very clear from the very first Greek program that from a strictly economic technical standpoint, that it was just kicking the can down the road. That it was clear that the debt projections that were made in terms of how much fiscal adjustment was going to take place, and that whether that was ultimately going to be sustainable, it was a completely unrealistic program, because for purely political reasons, growth projections were put into the program that was going to make the debt to GDP ratio stabilize within 2 or 3 years. From an economic standpoint, it was completely unrealistic, because there was nothing in the program that would actually stimulate growth in the Greek economy. So it was quite clear that it was just postponing the problem. And that was done 6 months later, a year later, every time the program got reviewed. Each time, of course, Greece ended up in more and more debt, with a deterioration of the underlying situation to the point where now the unemployment rate is 22%, where 1 out of 2 young people are out of work, and you have people burning the buildings in Athens. So we've lost 2 years by virtue of having kicked the can further down the road, with no resolution, with the economic and social problems being worse. And the only justification that I can see from the perspective of Germany, if you want to think about German leadership, is that now perhaps we have some mechanisms in place, the ESM, the EFS, such that when Greece inevitably declares bankruptcy and leaves the Eurozone, that now the Eurozone has this firepower that can presumably protect the others in place.
You think this is going to happen?
I think there's a very good chance that it will. Now, he can't say that.
Oh, I have to leave for another appointment just right now.
Well, but what everybody here on the panel will agree on, I think, is that a kind of a growth stimulus is necessary, or has been lacking but maybe you don't agree on what this could be. I think you think we need more activity on the demand side and more to enable German or European consumers to buy more goods. I'm not sure whether that would be your answer.
Well, let me first refer to what Mr. Fuß said. He's absolutely right, and it's true that there was a lot of political misguiding. I won't object that. We established a monetary union without establishing a political union with a more rigid coordination of fiscal and economic policy. And it's definitely true that France and Germany violated the Maastricht criteria in 2002, 2003. Nobody's interested to listen to the circumstances at that time, because in principle it was wrong. One of the main circumstances was, for example, that at that time Chancellor Schröder launched a very important reform program called Agenda 2010, which is to a certain extent very much responsible for the fact that Germany is now in a mood of Alice in Wonderland. So that was one of the reasons why we violated these criteria nearly 10 years ago. But not only decisions, Mr. Fuß, even non-decisions have consequences. And as a politician, you have to be responsible for it. So there's a very old quotation I kept in my mind of an American admiral. I think it was Admiral Rickover. And he said, well, think, that's all you guys can do when you get off your ass and do something. So there are sometimes situations where you have to do something, right or wrong. You have to give clear signals. And you have to make and pass decisions, and that's the difference between politicians, journalists, and professors. You have to.
You're the one who has to do it.
Yes,
eventually.
Yes, and
You're
I have
a professor now. I've heard.
And I have to do it by insufficient information. That's the difference.
So has
That's
angst
the
of
big
leadership ever been a problem for you?
For me?
Yeah.
No.
Man, it's a serious question. I think it may
No,
have.
you are not a psychologist, aren't you?
Well, angst is our topic
No,
today.
perhaps we can get back to this point. Well, what I wanted to underscore is, perhaps a leading from behind might make sense, but on the other side, when I look to the last 2 years, the contagion risks have increased by not undertaking a strong and a comprehensive crisis management. And in particular, the resentments emerged in the meantime, and the political situation in Europe is more and more polluted and poisonous. And that makes a crisis management now even harder and more difficult than, for example, 2 years ago.
I think everybody here on the panel is in one way or another critical of the management of the Eurozone, which is not surprising, and also of the type of German leadership for different reasons. What I would like to understand is why, despite of all these weak points, Germany is admired for what it does to such a large extent. Angela Merkel and her government are highly popular. In Germany, 70% of the Germans say they like what she does, and I was giving Mr. Steinbrück's party a hard time at the moment. But also in other countries. I mean, you've already mentioned Sarkozy getting help from Merkel, asking help from Merkel in his election campaign, or I would like to quote Mr. Radek Sikorski, the foreign minister of Poland, who said in his speech in Berlin in November 2011, he said, what do I regard as the biggest threat to security and prosperity of Poland today on the 28th of November in 2011? It's not terrorism, it's not the Taliban, it's certainly not German tanks, it's not even Russian missiles, which President Medvedev has just threatened to deploy on the EU's border. The biggest threat to the security and prosperity of Poland would be the collapse of the Eurozone. And then he carries on saying, I demand of Germany that for our own sake, for your own sake and for ours, you help it survive and prosper. I fear German power less than I'm beginning to fear German inactivity. So it seems that despite all the negative aspects that you've mentioned, quite a big group of people seems to like the German austerity policy. Why is that so? Haven't they not listened to your arguments and to the points you made enough? Do we need more of this type of conferences?
Do you want me to respond? Well, you know, in a way it is surprising that after 2 years of a growth rate of like 3%, so many people think that there is, you know, some miracle going on in Germany. I mean, this has come surprisingly, and I'm afraid this will go away equally surprisingly and maybe equally quickly. So. Yeah. You know, this is very much, I suppose, I'm afraid, it's sort of a short-term mood, and if things go wrong in the Eurozone, you know, this can turn into the opposite very quickly. You know, I mean, this quotation you mentioned, I think, maybe addresses not just Germany, but really the European Union as a whole. I think there is this issue. And to that I agree. There is this issue of absence of leadership or, you know, active, rational policy at the European level as a whole. And I think this is what the Polish minister addresses here, and I think that's very true. As I said, if there was any type of leadership within Europe, the trouble is it would have to do the right thing, and there is to some extent, what would be the right thing now is subject to debate, obviously. But I think here really is the issue. We have to think hard about a concept that will solve this crisis at a European scale, and I very much agree that this cannot be a solution where some people are fine and some countries are doing well and other countries are losing. Maybe our discussion is also focusing too much on Greece. I mean, I wouldn't be so concerned if it was just about Greece. In Germany we have places like the state of Bremen and the state of Saarland. These are places that are in financial difficulties, maybe worse than Greece, but nobody really cares because they just get the money, they just get subsidized, and
but that's not your suggestion. What we should do with
affected.
Greece?
If it was just Greece, I would probably say, let's do it in the same way. Let's just give them the money. But we have this entire periphery, and we face the question of long-term governance in the Eurozone, and the periphery is just too big to let this go and give them the money. My personal view, if I may say that, is that one error that has been made is that too much focus has been put. Too much emphasis has been put on government debt and too little on the financial sector. I think if there is any way of making progress in the Eurozone, I think the first step would be to get stronger central control over the financial sector. Dani just mentioned, look at Florida. What happens if Florida has a problem? What happens if California has a problem? It will not mean that Californian banks fall apart. In Europe, we have a financial system where we have a very unhealthy symbiosis between the financial sector in each country and the government. That's why, if the Italian government has a problem, UniCredit has a problem, their banks have a problem. So I think the first step towards addressing this would be a reform of the European financial sector. We need a very stringent European banking supervision. We need European restructuring mechanisms for banks that do not depend on national finances, and strong central control. And this is, if you want to control fiscal policy, you have to interfere with people's lives. You have to, Brussels has to tell the Portuguese, you have to work until you're 70. This will never work. I'm sorry. It's completely, it's utopian. I would like to have a European state where we agree on everything, but for the next 20 years, this is completely utopian. I think it's not utopian to have a centralized financial sector. This is more technical, a centralized banking supervision. And if we had that, we wouldn't need to be so worried about Italian government finance, But this is something the political, with the exception of those who are present, the political class doesn't get. Instead they start. I'm sorry to say that, but we have this talk of financial transactions taxes and these things. This will solve no problem. You can do it. I don't think it does a lot of harm, but it will not address any problem. What we really need is, for instance, in Germany, the German government is blocking this. We have these wonderful local savings banks and our Volksbank. They have no access to capital markets, and the German government wants to protect them against stricter capital requirements. This is absolutely ridiculous. We have to give up this focus on narrow little things, national interests, and I think the first step would be to have a proper European banking system where the ECB acts as a lender of last resort for all banks. And then if we have this basis, it's much easier to deal with government debt problems. But even that, it seems, is too bold. Even that, this would be a kind of leadership I would think makes sense. But even that seems to be too bold. The interests of the financial sector seem to be too strong. It's impossible. If we start with fiscal policy and try to centralize that, we can forget about it.
Is it only the interest in the financial sector, or is it also a different approach to institutions? I think that's something you have been interested in your work in Oxford, comparisons of different national mentalities. And you told me about experiments that show that somehow the Germans, if you have an experimental setup, a group of Germans would always be more trustful, have a more trustful approach to institutions of all kinds. So is it maybe that Germans they like the ECB. They don't want to change the rules as much as, I mean, Americans, Danny Rodrigues, when we talked before this, said to me, well, what about the ECB's mandate? Mandates are man-made and you can change a mandate. This is really something Germans or a lot of Europeans wouldn't say to the same extent. So what you're suggesting, isn't that something that really makes sense to Germans, having a basic financial institution that regulates financial markets, and does it really work with the other European countries?
Well, I would hope it would. Of course, I mean, there are very different mentalities. I think Danny mentioned this when we started discussing this. You know, in Germany, there's this view, you know, when people spend too much, you know, they should be punished in a way. You know, there's a culture in Germany that says, you know, if you waste money, you should pay for it, and maybe, you know, or if you cheat, you know, if you publish wrong statistics. I think in many other countries, you know, people would say, okay, I mean, we got this wrong.
Partying in Greece.
Yes, I mean, we got this wrong. Let's forget about it. Let's move on. And I think there is something to the German culture saying that, you know, maybe people should be punished, or at least, you know, shouldn't get away with this too easily. And other countries understand this a lot. There is actually experimental evidence suggesting that, but you know, I would overestimate this. You know, in the end, if we can't agree on common institutions in Europe, this won't work. But we have got to a set of institutions, so I would be optimistic we can agree on more.
Danny Roderick, one of the leadership challenges that you mentioned is in the short term, that the crisis should be tackled by stimulating demand policy. Do you have an explanation why that is so much more popular with American economists compared to German ones, or also European politicians of all kinds? Is it that aging countries in Europe just have a different problem with high public debt opposed to a country like the United States with a younger population and increasing population?
There are huge debates within the US as well, but I think you're probably right. But I wonder if it's mostly a German, non-German issue. I mean, I don't understand the German academic establishment at all and the stand that they've taken on this. But I think there's a sort of a reinforcement. You know, I think between what the political leadership take is on questions of stimulus and sort of what kind of academic or economic advice gets fed in. And I think for historical reasons, again, I'm not an expert on Germany, but there seems to be, for historical reasons, this, you know, huge aversion to anything that sounds inflationary, that you know, you spend more money, prices might rise, and I'm told by, you know, people who speak more to German economists than I do, that, you know, sort of, you know, that eventually within the third or fourth minute of the exchange, you know, the German hyperinflation of the 1920s will come up, and so there's a historical aversion to these kinds of issues, and I think. And unfortunately, it has led, as I said at the outset, into turning what is an economic, was a problem of interdependence, what's an economic problem, into a morality play, turning into a narrative about sort of one-sided profligacy and so forth. And I think, given that Europe doesn't have European leadership, naturally, everybody is looking at Germany as the bigger player, as looking at Merkel. And I think Merkel seems to have wholeheartedly adopted this moralistic attitude to the crisis. I remember a conversation a couple of months ago with the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. And the Netherlands, of course, in some sense is even worse than Germany because they have a much larger current account surplus. So in some ways, you know, the only difference is it's a much smaller economy, so they don't have as much of an influence on what's happening. And after this long conversation about how policies of austerity and fiscal belt tightening and so forth was only making things worse, and that there needed to be a different kind of stimulus in a differentiated way, that there were some countries which had room for it and other countries that didn't. And he said, well, I think I can explain what you're telling me to the Dutch population, to my own people, but I would never be able to convince Merkel. And so, the paradox is that it's not just sort of Merkel seems to be leading from behind it, and then the rest is also leading from behind Merkel, and it just doesn't make for for the good kind of leadership. Now, I think there isn't a single thing that would have got it. I don't think the solution to this is pump priming. It's not just spending, but there are certainly things in the short term that could have been done that would have been an alternative strategy that would have had much better chance of dealing with problems of Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy. That would have entailed raising the inflation target of the European central banks to give some room for prices to rise so that countries could recover nominal competitiveness a little bit more quickly, and also lowering the value of the euro. Some increase in consumption in countries like the Netherlands and Germany that can actually afford it. The kind of guarantees at the margin for borrowing or some kind of Eurobond that would have given markets confidence, a very clear signal. And domestically, in the context of these countries, coordinated wage price cuts that could have simulated to some extent an internal devaluation instead of these governments like the Greek government and Spanish government wasting a lot of political capital on labor market reforms and structural reforms, which, as good as they may have been for the medium to long term, actually do nothing at all for the short term. So there was a better combination of things that would have collectively at least have given these countries a chance.
May I come back to some points Mr. Fuß mentioned? The first is in the economic view. I think the productivity, the purchase power, or the debt situation of Florida or California or Oregon, or between Saarland and Schleswig-Holstein, very little German local states, differ exactly in the same way as, for example, between Greece and Germany. No difference at all. But there's one crucial point. In our federal states, in the United States as well as in Germany, there is sort of an equalization system. And up to now, we have no comparable equalization system in Europe. And the deep question, or the crucial question is, are we going to establish such an equalization system or not?
Would you like that?
Well, I can't be helpful to level up Greece, for example, to the same competitiveness of Germany or the same economic strength. But, well, to contain the current drift and, well, to reduce the enormous imbalances in the European Union, in my eyes, are absolutely necessary. And that will cost some money. And in my eyes, it's for sure that it will cost some money for Germany. Undoubtedly. And we have it to explain to our people. I come back to a key word of Danny Roderick, a narrative. The political class in Germany missed to elaborate a new narrative in Germany to convince the people, well, it is in our interest to be helpful in reorganizing and to be helpful in Europe. Such a narrative worked in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and my impression is after the implosion of the Soviet regime, we missed to elaborate a new narrative while Europe is so important and worthwhile. And this narrative should not only be impressed or be conducted by an economic explanation. Europe must be explained as a Western civilization project with social security, an independent jurisdiction, a separation of state and church. Very important. Yes, somebody understood me. Yeah.
Do you have an...
No. Oh, I'm at the very beginning of my contribution. So what we need, and then I'll make it brief after you have puzzled me. We need such a narrative. And that could be perhaps the right explanation to convince our people, well, it is worthwhile to pay for this Europe. I will give you a figure. There was a West-East transfer after the German reunification between the last 20 years of round about 2,000 billion euros. An average 100 billion each year. 2,000 billion euros. And now I try to tell my people, well, if we were capable and able to finance a transfer of 2,000 billion euros in 20 years for the German reunification, Shouldn't we be able and capable to pay 200 in 4 or 5 or 6 years to stabilize Europe? The answer is yes. So I come back to 3 political points. For example, this financial transaction tax. You misunderstood what the politicians want. This financial transaction tax is not an instrument to civilize the financial markets or even to discipline them. It's a question of legitimacy. Why? Well, I myself met with Mrs. Merkel. We launched, for example, a Financial Stability Act in Europe, in Germany, on the peak of the turmoils in autumn 2008. And this Financial Stability Act was combined with guarantees, capital injections, and the financing of bad banks in an amount of 500 billion euros. 500 billion euros. And then I went to my constituency and to other places, and all the people asked me, you have 500 billion euros for the banks? And after 2 glasses of white wine, they said, you have 500 billion euros for the bankers? What are you doing for me? What about the school of my kids? What about the maintenance of the social security? What about more investments for the public infrastructure? But you have 500 billion euros for the banks and for the bankers? So that's the point. Because they say, well, please ask me, who is paying for all the consequences of these damn turmoils? And they said, it's me, the taxpayer, the ordinary people, they are paying for it. Is there any instrument that the financial sector itself is contributing to finance the consequences of a partly caused crisis? So that's the point why I'm in favor for a financial transaction tax. Because the sector itself has to contribute to a certain extent in financing, well, what they have caused. Widely, not only. The political stage has made many problems too. So that's very important from a political point of view, not from an academic or economic point of view. And by the way, or incidentally, the revenues of such a financial transaction tax, couldn't be these revenues the basis for financing recovery programs for Mediterranean countries? No bad solution. No bad solution. So suddenly I think we have to enhance our discussions between the academic and economic expert rounds with some political thoughts we keep in our mind, because sometimes I think they are criticized from a very diverse point of standing.
Okay, thank you. Being here in Harvard, this is probably, at least for me, probably one of the most intelligent audiences I've ever had. So it would be a waste not to give room to some of your questions. So please feel invited if you would like to. Yeah, please raise your hand over there, and please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Nick Ziegler. I teach at UC Berkeley, currently visiting at MIT and the Center for European Studies here. I'm very glad to hear these remarks on private sector participation. And of course, I agree with the panelists that this is a multidimensional crisis with many aspects of leadership. But one feature of leadership which Angela Merkel has managed almost to achieve so far, which was not achieved in the United States, is making private sector bond holders participate in the current restructuring of Greek debt by taking some kind of a haircut. And that's very difficult because the financial community in Europe is so much more fragmented. So there's a collective action problem, which means I think we have to give the politicians some credit for dealing with an extremely complicated and unwieldy decision-making challenge, much more so than Ben Bernanke or Hank Paulson had in the United States. They only had to persuade one Congress. They went up on Capitol Hill twice, and the second time they convinced the House of Representatives, yes, we'll go forward. So my question is, how at this point in time can Angela Merkel and Olli Rehn, Barroso, other political leaders make sure that the private sector haircut is actually concluded successfully. That is one of the current issues, whether this negotiation will succeed. And part of the issue is they have to make British banks agree to a very substantial haircut, and they don't have any way to do that. It only illustrates the complexity of the situation I'm interested in. I just wonder if the panelists have any thoughts about how, in the short term, to manage these complexities, and in particular, making the British banks do the same thing that the French and German banks have to do to make this whole deal go through. Thank you very much.
Would you like to answer that?
Do you want me to answer that? I think there are two things to say here. I think it is true, it is one of the main achievements also to some extent of Angela Merkel's leadership that we have this private sector participation. This was a very difficult debate. A lot of people said, you know, you're completely crazy, you must not do this because this is going to lead to contagion and everything. And I think it was very important to do it. You know, the way it was carried out is more controversial. I mean, what you say about British banks having to agree is a consequence of the fact that this has been arranged as a voluntary haircut. And I have to say, I have talked to a lot of people and experts in the field, and I have never understood why it had to be that way. Because this is not just, you know, this is not just creating a lot of uncertainty. Of course, this will not work because, you know, some of these bonds are held by hedge funds. They have insured their holdings, and they have strong interests not to participate, and a lot of them will not participate. I mean, there are many people speculating here. Many people have bought Greek bonds exactly to wait and see, you know, whether they will have to agree. And this whole idea of a voluntary exchange is also undermining the entire market for insurance, because in the future, how do you insure yourself? You know, if you invest anywhere, if you don't know whether some governments come along and sort of undermine your private contract. So I think this part wasn't very convincing. But you know, the fact that Angela Merkel, you know, had you know, the persistence to insist on this private sector participation, I think was a very positive example of leadership. I know that some people disagree and say, you know, this created all the contagion. You know, I think it was good. It took a long time, but in the end, you know, it was a good outcome, because otherwise the bubble would just be inflated.
Well, you noticed I made no comment on the Chancellor of the Federal Republic, but now I have to. She isn't as brave as it sounds, because, well, the necessity of a haircut has been outspoken by many, many experts and even some politicians a year before Mrs. Merkel set that point on her agenda. So it's very, very late that the private creditors have been invited to talk about a haircut on a voluntary basis. So I think it should have happened a year ago. I can remember some American experts, some German experts, even some German politicians. I don't want to mention my former fellow Minister Steinmeier, who published an article in the Financial Times about that, and so on. So it's very late that now it is negotiated, and it is already negotiated. There's one problem. When this would mean that these private banks are compelled to have a write-down of around about 50, 60, or even 70%. And that might be possible. And at the same time, we are going to implement Basel III with higher Tier 1 capital requirements. We could cause a new problem concerning the capital basis of these banks. So even this issue has to be driven very carefully.
Okay, that's the next question.
Okay, my name is Andrew Martin. I'm at the Center for European Studies. Question for Steinbrück. Oh, maybe I don't need it. I don't know.
Maybe for the people in the back.
Okay, I will do that. The question is about macroeconomic policy in relation to the design of the fiscal compact. You remember that, I guess it was back in 2008, you criticized George Brown for pursuing crass Keynesianism. So your spokesman explained that you were only referring to Brown's use of VAT cuts. That leaves open the possibility that there is a Keynesianism that's not crass. I would like to know if you believe this is to be true, and if so, how it should apply to the current European policies for dealing with the design of the debt brake in the fiscal compact in the context of deep recession?
You refer obviously to Mr. Asmussen, the former state secretary in my ministry. First remark. Second remark, I'm glad to hear that in the United States is something to happen like a revitalization of Keynesianism. Because, well, I suffered to a wide extent by the monetaristic school of the Chicago boys for 30 years. And now a lot of American professors, and I met one when I was invited to lunch, suddenly I'm very much in favor in Keynesian policy, because they asked and called the Germans, you must launch more and more credit finance stimulus packages.
Mr. Roderick is very fond of that too.
Yes, yes. I talked to Mr. Stieglitz and to Mr. Rogoff and some other of these dukes of the American dukes of the economic sciences, and I'm not far away. But you see, it was an American monetaristic school which tried to convince us for 30 years that stimulus packages and deficit spending is near to the evil empire. And now you suddenly call us Germany. Well, your debt crisis, well, please forget it. You have to increase your stimulus packages to an amount of not only 100, but 250, 300 billion euros, something like that. So that appears to me a little bit strange. Concerning the debt brake, the debt brake means, or doesn't include an anti-cyclical economic policy. It is allowed. But in a long-term view, you need, or you are compelled by our constitution only to, or you are compelled to a structural deficit of 0.35 in comparison to your GDP. So you can make a Keynesian policy during an economic downturn, but afterwards, to understand Keynes entirely, and not only to the half, you have to pay back the money you picked up on the financial markets. So, and it's exactly the same manner for the European countries. And additionally, we established sort of a so-called economic semester that is a macroeconomic observation, and the Commission or some workforces of the Commission will make recommendations how to be helpful on one side for countries who are suffering or which are suffering, and on the other side, well, to come back to stability or to balances.
Next question is with the young lady.
Hi, my name is Laura Daniels. I'm a research fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard. I would like to urge all the participants on the panel to think a little bit beyond the day. I mean, I'm personally very confident that the fiscal compact and all these things that have been discussed by Per Steinbrück before have a future, even leaving out such an important partner as Great Britain. Now, if you look beyond that project and you go back to the questions that have been raised before about financial market transaction taxes, or even about more financial market regulation, how are you going to solve these problems? How are you going to solve collective action problems without Britain at the table? And so I'm asking you, and it's a serious question, what does it take? Can you give us solutions how we can get that important country back to the table in order for all of us to find common solutions to urgent problems that cannot just be not addressed, as you mentioned before. We have to solve those problems, so we have to solve them together. What does the European Union, what does continental Europe have to offer the British? So I'd like to hear more on that.
The question is, what is Britain offered to Europe?
Well, that won't solve
yes, it's an
the
easy,
gridlock.
It's an easy question. It's an easy answer. Mr. Cameron was asked to agree the fiscal compact by all the other heads of state and government. And Prime Minister Cameron said, well, I will only agree on an amendment of the European Treaty, including this fiscal compact, when you're going to offer me further privileges for the City of London. And all the continental heads of state and government refused to do so. And they were right, absolutely right. My Chancellor, the French President, and so on. Mr. Cameron was only going to adopt this when he received, or he would have received, more privileges for the City of London. And this is unacceptable. So it was his move to stay alone and to go outside. I'm very much in favor that we have to improve our regulation and supervision regarding the financial markets. From a British point of view, I can understand his position, because I have not only a faint idea that the City of London is contributing or generating, I think, around about 15 or 16% of the British GDP. So the Brits are going to defend these privileges to the last drop of their blood. But it is not a question for us. So whenever the Brits would like to join the club, they are welcomed. But whenever they ask me that they want to have further privileges in sort of a deregulation, they can't expect that the Germans will agree.
Would you like a brief comment?
Yeah, yeah.
In Britain?
Yeah, maybe because, you know, I see this from more from the British side, perhaps. I mean, you have to see. I'm sorry, there's no one to properly represent this place here on the panel. I mean, we have to see first of all that you know we have this proposal of a financial transactions tax on the table coming from Baron and Schäuble. And this is, I mean, it's perfectly clear that there is. I mean, I talked to a German, a rather high-ranking politician about this, and he told me, you know, I know it makes no sense, but they are trying to put them to the cross. It's exactly what you're saying. So people want some form of, let's say, revenge, and you know, they want to see the bankers suffer. The trouble is, this is the wrong. I mean, even if you want to collect money from the financial sector, it's the wrong instrument, and that's why it's not going to come.
Come on.
That's why it's not going to come. But you have to see, you know, from the British side, a suggestion like that would be equivalent to telling the Germans, well, you know, we are very concerned about the environment. Let's introduce a tax on large passenger cars. You know, I'm sure Mrs. Merkel would say, you know, if you want to do that, you will have a hard time. We will not allow it. It may be true that, you know, the environment is an important thing, but the Germans would never accept it. And this is what's going on in Britain. You know, I'm not defending the City of London. I think there are a lot of outrageous things going on there. But we should remind ourselves, I mean, this is another narrative which is misguided. The narrative in Europe is the British aren't doing anything about financial sector regulation. I mean, the British are more in favor of stricter capital requirements than the Germans. The British have introduced a bonus tax. The Germans haven't. The British have introduced a bank levy. The Germans have done it now. But, you know, I think there's only one bank paying it. So, you know, I think a little more understanding for both sides would be appropriate, you know. I mean, I personally see no harm in the British not taking part in the fiscal pact because, you know, they are not part of the Eurozone. Why should they? I mean, why should they? And they don't believe it's going to work, and I don't believe it's going to work. I mean, I can see that, you know, it is a political signal. It has a certain significance, but I would recommend to actually read this document. You know, when you read it, for instance, it says one-time expenditures are exempt. You know, it's a joke. You know, the fiscal pact is something that Germans have sold to the rest of Europe, and the other Europeans think, you know, we will, if we sign it, the Germans are happy. You know, it is, as some people in the UK have said, it is a stability pact with lipsticks because we have exactly the same rules in the stability pact. So, you know, and in a way, I think it's almost tragic that the Germans believe so much in constitutional rules. You know, if the Germans have a problem, they say, let's do a constitutional rule because, you know, they like this. They have this culture that everybody has to play by the rules. But, you know, I think in the rest of Europe, this is interpreted differently. Just by writing down something on paper, you can't really impose it. So that's why I personally think, you know, let's be a bit more relaxed about this. You know, let the Brits go their way, and let's not take this fiscal pact too seriously.
Okay, you can rule the waves and wave the rules. And I got the lesson. I got the lesson. But nevertheless, coming back to it's not a question of revenge, Mr. Frues. Definitely not. We are talking about a tax rate of 0.05%. And everybody here in this convention hall has to pay a VAT on goods and services. And the only excluded part is a financial deal. not a VAT of 19 like in Germany, not a reduced VAT in Germany like 7%, but 0.05% as a contribution to refinance the consequences of these financial turmoils. I think it's not the end. It's not the end of history. Definitely not. And whenever the Brits don't want to join such an agreement, I say, okay, you can make what you want. I accept your sovereign decisions, but I'm very much in favor to implement such a financial transaction tax in continental Europe, in particular the European Monetary Union. And I would start with those 7, 8, 9 countries who have already declared their willingness to do so, in particular France. And I think Italy too, because we need the financial place of Milan in a solution.
Okay, I think we haven't really answered the question about how to get Britain back on the table, but we've given a little demonstration of why it's so difficult to get there. At this point, I would like to thank you very much for a very interesting, inspiring discussion, for being very outspoken. Put the blame on me if the German ambassador should call you. And I thank you all for listening.
Now ask this British guy there, over there.
Okay, they may. But you can also put the blame on me. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I think we meet each other again after the coffee break. Coffee break. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Roddick.
Thank you. Will you join the dinner this evening?
So we will return back at 3:45 to hear a discussion between an American and a German soldier. So that's one of my favorite sessions here. So make sure you're here on time to hear about the perspectives of two soldiers. Thank you very much.